Next is Shahab Golshan, and he's presenting about particle methods in deal.II. It's worked together with Bruno and with Rene.
Yeah, and in fact, I will be taking over the first 10 minutes and Shahab will take over the second half of the talk. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. So in this talk, I will speak a bit about particle methods in deal.II, and then Shahab will take over and present one of the very cool applications of particle methods in deal.II. And before I get started, I should mention that this is actually work that is by now done by a lot of people. So I started the initial implementation of some particle infrastructure in deal.II, but by now many people have contributed to that, and it's much better than it was at the initial stage. So in particular, Shahab and Bruno Blais in Canada, Wolfgang has contributed a lot. Gary Puckett at UC Davis, Luca Heltai in Italy, Martin and Peter have contributed as well. So this is now part of deal.II and is also part of the infrastructure that is maintained and supported and improved by many people. So to get started, I wanted to quickly talk about what we mean when I talk about particle methods. So as you know, deal.II in its fundamental basis is a finite element library, which in particular means that it usually is used to solve equations on a certain domain, and the solution of these equations is defined in this whole domain. And whether it's continuous or discontinuous, it's usually known at every point in this domain, and the domain is considered a continuum. But for many applications, it's actually also useful to know the properties of the solution at discrete locations and maybe track these discrete locations over time. And in order to allow that, the deal.II contains functionality to create and track a set of discrete particles, or tracers or markers, or however it's called in your field of study. But how these particles are actually used in your application is up to you. The library doesn't make any assumptions on how the particles are used. And there are many different applications, as you will see, and different methods that use particles in some form. So for example, the particle and cell method, and the variant marker and cell method. There's the discrete element method, smooth particle hydrodynamics, fluid structure interaction. All of these things use particles in some form. And the particle infrastructure in deal.II tries to provide you some support to use these methods if you want to. So let's see how the particle infrastructure in deal.II fits into all of the rest of deal.II. As you know, if you typically run a deal.II program, you define a triangulation that describes your solution domain, and then you define a finite element, and together you can use this to set up a DOF handler class that enumerates the degrees of freedom in your domain. And then you can define a finite element solution on the whole domain, which describes the solution of your equation. The particle infrastructure sits aside to this existing infrastructure, but it has a very similar structure in the sense that there is a class that's called particle handler, which is responsible for owning and organizing the particles. And this class internally has two most important components, the particle container, which sorts the particles into their current cells. So the particles in deal.II are always connected to the triangulation, to the solution domain that you have. And it owns the property pool, which actually stores the data for each particle. There's also a convenience class that's called particle. So if you think of a single particle, you could think of an object of type particle, but that is actually not used inside of the particle handler. The particle handler stores the data in a more efficient way instead of storing many, many particles. So how would the minimal deal.II program that uses particles look like? I just put up the minimal example that I could think of that does something with particles, just to show you how the code would look like. Just as for a normal deal.II computation, you would set up a triangulation, and then you would generate the grid in this triangulation, in this case, a very simple hypercube. You would define a simple mapping, and that's all you need to set up a particle handler. this particle handler is empty at first. So you need to generate some particles. And you could either do this manually by inserting particle objects at the locations where you want to put them, or you use one of the convenience functions in the generator's namespace. In this case, this function generates particles in statistically random positions, 16 of them per cell. And afterwards, you have a fully set up particle distribution in your domain. Then you can do all kinds of things with these particles, whatever your method would require. So for example, you could loop over all of them and print out the location of the particles to screen, and maybe set up a data out object that will take these particles and write them to an output file. Obviously, you would want to do something useful in between here. So for example, you would want to move the particles around, or you would store some properties on them and develop these properties over time. But this is the basic structure of how a particle program could look like. So what kinds of things can you do with the infrastructure that is there already? So I mentioned the generators that can create different particle distributions, and these are just some examples of particle distributions that you could generate. Depending on the application, you could want to have a statistical distribution of particles or some regular shape to better see the deformation, or some user-defined patterns. For example, the particles following an interface between two separate regions in your domain. One of the important questions in the particle infrastructure is, how does this scale in distributed computations? deal.II is set up to allow for very large scale computations in parallel, and it does so by balancing the number of cells between different processes in your domain. So if each parallel process gets around the same number of cells and the amount of work per cell is approximately constant, that will allow you to scale to very large computations. But that gives you a problem in particle computations, because you can have situations like this on the left-hand side, where you have particles mostly in some cells of the domain and not in others. If you would distribute this domain equally between different processes, so each process would have the same number of cells, that would not scale very well. And so the particle handler allows you to instead distribute the domain according to the number of particles per cell instead of the number of cells per process. And it allows you to do a weighted average between the two. So you could say, I have to do some work on the cells, I have to do some work on the particles. So let's try to average, or let's try to distribute both of them more or less equally between domains. And that could lead to a distribution or a partitioning between different MBI processes, as you can see in this animation, where the colors show which process owns which part of the domain. And the partitioning is set up in a way so that each process approximately has the same number of particles instead of the same number of cells. This animation was made by Bruno Blais for step 68. And this allows you to achieve pretty good parallel scaling for these methods. So on the right-hand side, you see strong scaling for different parts of the particle algorithm. On the left-hand side, you see weak scaling. And you can see that particle methods have the property that they scale pretty well in a strong scaling sense. So you see a nearly perfect strong scaling in all cases. But the weak scaling depends somewhat on the load balancing that is used. And if you would not use this repartitioning that I mentioned on the last slide, then you would see that the weak scaling decreases with increasing number of cores, simply because you have more and more particles on certain processes, but not on others. But if you use this rebalancing, then you actually achieve pretty good weak scale. Okay, let's just quickly look at some applications before I hand over to Shahab to go more into a special application. So this is the application that I'm using particles a lot for. I'm a computational geodynamicist. I work on deformation in the Earth, especially in the solid Earth's mantle, which on long time scales convects like a fluid. And what you see here is a pretty typical mantle convection simulation. So you see deformation inside of the Earth's mantle, where cold material from the surface, continental plates or most oceanic plates, actually subduct into the mantle and then sink to the core mantle boundary because they are cold, and hot material that is heated up by the core rises to the surface. And in these computations, we use particles to keep track of where material came from and where it goes, and what type of rock we are looking at. So we keep track of where does the ocean floor, for example, go over time? Where does it end up inside of the Earth's mantle? And you can see this in the right side figure here. So the brown material there, that is former ocean floor that is now sinking towards the core mantle boundary. There are other applications that particles are used for in geodynamics. So this is an animation that was made by Menno Freitas at UC Davis, and he uses particles to track tensor properties of the material on them. So the rock, when it is deformed, consists of many small crystals, and the crystals have anisotropic material properties, and they deform with the flow over time and develop a fabric, a form of preferred orientation for deformation. And so in this model, he uses the particles to track a lot of tensors on each particle and evolve these tensors according to a complex ordinary differential equation on each particle. So the material properties deform with the flow. And final application that I wanted to show is part of the deal.II library, step 70, and work by Luca Heltai and Bruno Blais. And in this case, the particles are used to model a solid impeller inside of a fluid. So it models a fluid structure interaction between a solid part in the center and some fluid around it that is driven by the solid part. And this example uses particles both to model the impeller, so to transfer data between the solid part and the fluid part of the model, but also to put some particles into the fluid domain to track the deformation of the fluid. So you can see that these blue tracers here are particles that were put into the flow just to see how they deform over time. If you want to know more about different applications of particles, there are now 3 steps example programs that describe how to use them. And there's also a publication about the general structure of the particles in deal.II that we wrote in 2018. Some things have changed since then, but a lot is still the same. And with that, I will hand over to Shahab to let him talk about one of the newest and most exciting applications of particles.
Thank you, Rene. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to present the fundamentals of the discrete element method and introduce LeTa-DEM and new DEM software. LeTa-DEM is open source. It is fully parallel with load balancing. It is available on GitHub, and it is built upon the deal.II library. LeTa-DEM is a module of LeTa, which was initially a high-order CFD software. We are developing LeTa in our team, and the DEM solver is a rather new solver of LeTa. At the moment, we are working on CFD and DEM coupling solvers, which would enable us to simulate multi-phase systems where solid and liquid phases are interacting with each other. Okay, let's start with the main applications of DEM. Granular material is prevalent in nature and several industries. Approximately half of the products and 3/4 of the raw material in the chemical industry is in the form of granular materials. There are 2 main approaches for modeling granular systems, continuum and discrete models. Compared to continuum models, discrete models are more accurate since the discrete essence of the granular system is preserved. Discrete element method is an iterative Lagrangian model for simulating granular material. In soft sphere DEM, as you can see in the animation, particles can overlap during the contact, and the particle-particle and particle wall contact forces are derived from these overlaps. I have to mention that the overlap in this animation is exaggerated to illustrate the concept. In the simulations, however, the overlap is generally less than 1% of the particle's diameter. DEM is very accurate, but with a high computational cost. To search the pairwise contact between the particles, the distance between all the particle pairs should be investigated in the worst case scenario. This leads to a high computational cost of ONP2, where NP is the number of particles. But with limiting the distance check to only neighbor particles, the computational cost decreases to ONP log NP. To this end, we use a two-step context search approach with broad search and fine search steps. So in LetterDEM, first of all, the parameters of DEM are initialized. Then the broad search is called. In the broad search, we find the adjacent particle pairs in the neighbor cells. We use deal.II triangulation and grid generator as well as particle handler for finding neighbor cells and residing particles in these cells. In the next step, these contact candidates are transferred to the fine search. In the fine search, we calculate the distance between all the pairs in the contact candidate and find the particle pairs which are very close to each other. By finding these overlaps between these particle pairs, and we can calculate and apply the contact forces on the particles and find the new velocities and positions of them in the next time step using integration. So these steps are repeated until the simulation reaches the final simulation time. This slide shows only a few examples of the deal.II methods used in LetterDEM. We use particle handler to manage the particles. Sort particles into subdomains and cells is used to map the particles into the cells. This mapping is used in the broad search, of course. For updating the information of ghost particles, we use update ghost. In parallel simulations, we divide the contacts into two main classes of local and local ghost contacts. The owner process handles the calculation of local contacts, while for a local ghost contact, two processes do the calculations, each for their local particle. We use local and ghost particles of deal.II to implement this modeling method in LetterDEM. So in this slide and the next slide, you see three animations of simulations performed by LetterDEM. This slide shows the simulation of a flat bottom and a wedge-shaped silo. The particles fill the hopper region and get packed on top of a stopper. Then the stopper is removed and the particles leave the hopper and fill a bottom container. This is an animation of the simulation of a rotating drum using LetterDEM. The outer boundary rotates and applies force to the neighbor particles. This force chain leads to rotation of particles inside the drum. So in the following, I'll present the results of weak and strong scaling analysis of LetterDEM. You can read the definitions of the strong and weak scalings here. And I should mention that all the simulations were performed on Compute Canada clusters on nodes with 32 cores. So this slide shows the strong scaling results for the silo simulation. As particles move inside the simulation domain, the computational load changes on the processes. Consequently, we need to balance the computational load. The load balancing frequency is 1 Hertz in the simulation. And here you can see the cloud of particles and the distribution of the subdomains inside the silo. This figure here shows the strong scaling results. As you can see, for lower core counts, the strong scaling is a quasi-optimal. Load balancing decreases the computational time by around 30%. For the strong scaling in the rotating drum simulation, we use the single-step load balancing at t equal to 1.5 seconds, because after reaching the steady state condition in the drum, the particles occupy a specific part of the cylinder. The simulations are performed on 1 to 6 compute nodes, and using load balancing decrease the computational time by around 35%. For the weak scaling, we used a breaking of dam simulations. As you can see in the animation, the particles are inserted and packed in the left part of a box. Then the dam is removed, and the particles fill the entire length of the box. The weak scaling results show that the simulation times increases slightly with the number of processes at all the NP over NC values. NC is the number of cores. For NP over NC equal to 20,000 and more than 6 nodes here, The simulation times does not increase further, which represents near ideal weak scalability. So thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, please go ahead.
All right. Thanks, you two. I think this, so I am glad that we asked you to speak, because these are just really cool applications, and it's fun to see how this all works, because that is one of those things that deal.II was never built for. So it's really cool what you guys are doing up there in Canada. We have a minute or so. Do any of you want to ask questions?
I'll ask a quick question. So has anybody tried just attaching springs between particles yet? Do we have any, has anybody actually done some work with that, or has nobody tried that?
So I am not aware, but what Shahab, what you're doing is slightly similar as soon as the particles overlap, right?
Yeah.
So it's a near field interaction, not springs between all of the particles that exist.
Yes.
Okay, that's something I might want to try.
You may get into problems with the scalability there, because you have essentially n squared springs if you want to connect all particles with all particles. But you may probably only want to connect particles with their neighbors, or with close by. Yeah, that may be similar to what Shahab and Bruno are doing. So
I think so.
So can I ask another question?
Please.
So in the particles that you have at the boundary, you're assuming, I guess, that the dimension of the particles is always strictly smaller than the dimension of the grid size at the boundary. Is that correct? Otherwise, you could have interaction between particles which are more than one neighbor away with respect to the crossing boundary.
Yes, this is correct. And also in the coupling of CFD and DM solvers, we have a limitation to calculate the void fraction. So the grid cells should be larger than the particles, so that we can obtain a realistic void fraction distribution.